Good morning, or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm honored to be here at the World Agility Forum. I hope to be talking with you in Lisbon, Portugal, but as it happens, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. As you can see from the agenda, this is an ambitious conference that is addressing some pretty big issues, including the future of software, the future of management, and the future of organizations. We thought about throwing in the meaning of the universe, but after all, I think we have enough. Fortunately, we have a shortcut to the future. That's because I and some of the other speakers will be suggesting to you, like William Gibson in 2003, the future is already here. It's just very unevenly distributed. You may have already gathered that this is not like a typical Agile conference, which has often resembled a kind of echo chamber and did little more than reconfirm the participants' existing assumptions. This conference, you'll note that many different viewpoints will be represented. Some will be software developers, often see the Agile Manifesto as their guiding star. Some will be approaching the subject from the point of view of creating entire Agile organizations, like Darrell Rigby tomorrow. Some will be focusing on the lessons of firms like Google, Amazon, that seem to be doing things like Agile organizations, although they don't use the Agile labels, called the Silicon Valley model. But some will be telling us that management itself is the problem and that we should get rid of anyone who has the title of manager. And some will be telling us that the problem is Agile itself. And they will be saying that Agile thinking is confusing or leading us astray. All of these different viewpoints and others will be represented. And this was intentional. We believe that we will be stronger, not only if we understand what we have in common, but also if we can learn from our differences. We believe that most, if not all of the participants share at least two views. One, that there's something wrong with the way big organizations are currently run today. And two, there is, or could be, or should be, a better way of doing things. Our invitation to you: share your ideas. Be constructive, be curious, be open-minded, listen to those you don't agree with, find the positive even when you think it's wrong. In this talk, I'll be agreeing with the view that there is indeed something seriously wrong with the way big organizations are currently run. And I'm going to be calling that today 20th century management. This is not to say that all 20th century firms were always run this way. There were obviously many exceptions. It's suggesting that most big firms in the 20th century were run this way. And in fact, this is still true today. Most big firms are still run in accordance with 20th century management. This is a problem because 2020 is really quite different from the 20th century. I'll be arguing that there's a better way to get things done in the world, and I'm going to call that today 21st century management. In my last book, I called it Agile. But since there are those of you who don't like that label, I'm finding that when I use the broader term, I don't get tangled up in questions of definitions. And if you want to call it Agile, that's fine with me. But for today, I'm going to call it 21st century management. I'm calling the management I don't admire 20th century management, even though it's still practiced in firms today. It's taught in leading business schools. It's assumed in most management writing. It is what big consulting firms often practice. And it can become like a virus. It's highly contagious and continues to infect the English language. I believe it's a key to understanding and reaching 21st century management. In this talk, we'll be looking at several classes of things in an organization, mainly principles and processes. I think when we look at organizations, we can see that they usually have a characteristic set of principles which are about the why of the organization, which in due course leads to a set of processes and practices. By principles, I mean not what the management says the firm is doing. I'm talking about the prevailing mindset of the organization, if you like, the DNA of the firm. It's about what the firm actually does, not necessarily what the management says that it's doing or should be doing. It's about the why the firm acts the way it does. And these principles are well known to everyone inside the organization because they can be deduced from the behavior of the management. Staff can see who gets promoted and who doesn't. They can see why resources are allocated the way they are and why hard decisions are made in this way and not that. And the most important principles concern the goal of the firm, which sets direction, where it's heading. Secondly, the architecture of work. And thirdly, the dynamic of the firm. And 20th century firms converged on three core principles. So I say there were, of course, many exceptions, but by and large, the experiments didn't last. The most important principle is the goal of the firm. It was actually 50 years ago this month, Milton Friedman declared the only purpose of a firm is to make money for the company and its executives. The only purpose is to squeeze resources out of the firm so that it makes money for the firm. This is about maximizing shareholder value, a mantra that has ruled big business, particularly in the US, for the last 50 years. The second principle concerns the architecture of work. This is essentially bureaucracy, individuals reporting to bosses, filling roles and made to do what they're told. This was developed by Frederick Taylor in the US, Henri Fayol in France, and Max Weber in Germany. It's the characteristic way in which the work is architected in firms today. The necessity of organizing work this way flowed from the goal of the firm to make money. Since the staff aren't motivated to make money for the firm, they had to be told what to do. The third principle concerns the dynamic of the firm. The firm is a vertical hierarchy of authority. It's assumed that the boss knows best what to do and can tell everyone in the organization what they should be doing, even if others think differently or know better. Again, this flows from the first two principles. Since the goal was to make money and the firm was organized as a bureaucracy, there has to be a vertical hierarchy of authority. These three principles actually drove the behavior of most big firms in the last 50 years and continue to drive big organizations today. They also generated a set of processes in order to implement these basic principles. Thus, leadership came from the top of the organization and was transactional and manipulative. Strategy was backward-looking and defensive. Innovation was mainly about protecting the existing business. People management meant treating people as resources and controlling them so that they made money for the firm. Again, these kinds of processes flowed inevitably from the three principles. These principles and processes are the characteristic of 20th century management. And you'll note that underlying these principles and processes is the idea that the firm is a machine. The firm is something that can be controlled and measured and analyzed separately. Each individual part of the firm's behavior can be predicted. Its outputs are proportional to inputs. It can be understood separately from its context. Every problem has a root cause. This mechanistic way of thinking about the firm drove the principles and practices of the organization. And this way of managing is still prevailing in big organizations for several powerful reasons. First, it's coherent. It hangs together as a system. Second, it's well understood, and it is internally consistent. The executives are paid extremely well to maintain it and have come to feel comfortable in it. It was highly successful in the 20th century and led to the greatest material improvement in the human condition in history. So there was a great deal to be said for it, but there was a problem. The world changed. Four major changes made this way of running organizations no longer fitting the context. First, the accelerating pace of change. Then, drastic new technology came on the scene. Third, knowledge work replaced manual work. And most important, power in the marketplace shifted from the firm to the customer. The customer was now the boss of the organization. These four changes made it almost impossible for firms to operate in the old way. And managers, of course, noticed the problems, and they did many things to try to fix it. They tightened control, they downsized, they reorganized, they delayered, they re-engineered, they launched sales campaigns, they acquired new companies, but it didn't work. It wasn't that the machine was broken. The problem was the firm wasn't a machine at all. It was a different kind of entity. And so in the early 2000s, some firms started saying, we have to try something different. At the time, there were small unknown startups like Amazon, Google, Morningstar, firms that no one had ever heard of. And they started experimenting with a different way of running the organization. You'll hear many names other than 21st century management. In my last book, I called it Agile. Google calls it Project Aristotle. Amazon calls it Two Pizza Teams. The US military calls it Mission Command. Haya calls it Rindenhai. Some professors call it Adhocracy. There are all these different names for it, but I'm going to suggest to you that there are common principles and processes in these organizations which represent the core of 21st century management. And they are the opposite of the principles of 20th century management. In the first place, the firm had a different goal of the organization. They embraced Peter Drucker's dictum of 1954, there is only one valid purpose of a firm, to create a customer. In these firms, there is an obsession with creating more value for customers and users. That became the driving force, the goal, and the ideology of these organizations. And this was a fundamental paradigm shift in management, almost as transformational as the Copernican revolution in astronomy, when it became apparent to Copernicus and eventually to the rest of us that contrary to the evidence of our own senses, the sun is not revolving around the earth is actually revolving around the sun. Similarly, in management, it became apparent that a firm is not the center of the commercial universe. It is the customer or user who is at the center of the commercial universe. The firm is somewhere on the periphery, and its future depends on whether it can provide value to the customer. The customer becomes the boss of the organization. Second, the architecture of work. In order to deliver on this very, very different goal, work was architected in a different way. It drew on the full talents of the staff. This is the opposite of bureaucracy, with individuals filling roles and reporting to bosses. It's basically self-organization, typically using small self-organizing teams, working in short cycles, able to understand the customer, interact with the customer, try something different, and gradually iterate towards something that will actually create more value for the customer. It's a different way of organizing work in an organization. And thirdly, the dynamic was very different. Instead of a vertical hierarchy of authority, there was a horizontal network of competence. Ideas can come from anywhere in the organization. Sideways, up, down, whatever was necessary. It was a network, not a hierarchy of authority. This was a very different concept of the organization. It was seeing the organization not as a machine, but more like a garden, an interactive ecology. This meant that the organization couldn't be mechanically programmed the way a machine could be programmed or fixed. There was a shift from the idea of the firm as something complicated to something complex. There was a recognition that the firm couldn't be analyzed separately from its context. Its behavior couldn't be fully predicted. It could only be understood through interactions with the environment. And there was a recognition that the environment might well push back. And when these firms in the early 20th century had actually started adopting these principles, in due course they discovered that the processes that they had inherited from 20th century management, leadership, strategy, innovation, people management, were at odds with these very different principles. And so they had to reinvent the processes. They had to reinvent leadership and strategy and innovation, people management and budget. In leadership, instead of being transactional and manipulative, became something that occurred at every level, was based on human-to-human relationships. Strategy was dynamic and future-looking. Innovation was about creating new businesses as well as enhancing existing businesses. Talent management started treating people as people instead of resources to be managed and controlled. So these radically different processes started to develop. And when they had finally put these pieces together, they had a coherent way of running a 21st century organization. But of course, the evolution didn't stop. It had started by initially concentrating on delivering more value to the customer, and then finding ways to join with the customer and create an ecosystem within which the customer enjoyed more benefits because they were loyal to the firm. And then multiple firm loyalty. It became a system in which many suppliers joined together to deliver value to the customer. And then a further step when the firm started having interactions with customers. Customers were no longer just the recipients of products and services they began determining what services would actually be provided. And this way of managing has been an unprecedented success. Firms have prospered in the last year during the highly disruptive pandemic that is underway. The market capitalization of the largest of these firms is now equal to the bottom 300 stocks in the S&P 500. These firms are now the leading global brands: Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Google. And yet, despite all this success and all the financial dominance, the way big firms manage today is still in the mode of 20th century. It's what's taught in business schools, assumed in management writing, and what big consulting firms practice. And why would firms go on managing in a way which we know doesn't fit the context? The answers I receive are not entirely satisfactory. I've been told it won't scale, it's chaotic, it's a bubble, it won't last, gains aren't real. It's fundamentally just too different for the old guard to accept. It's a different way of thinking. These are not really good answers, and those answers are simply a reaction to something that is radically different. A paradigm shift takes time to embrace. It wasn't easy for existing firms, business schools, something firms to embrace a wholly different way of thinking about management. How do we make it happen? How do we get from 20th century management to 21st century management? We need to recognize that shifting from 20th century management to 21st century management involves a whole array of shifts in addition to a shift in mindset. We can see some common patterns that have emerged in successful cases. During this conference, we'll be hearing of some spectacular examples like that of Kurt Carlson at SRI International, where the top management was able over a period of years to lead the necessary change. More frequently, the change starts in the middle of the organization, where some enterprising leader says, we have to try something different. They start experimenting with some version of what I'm calling 21st century management. In agile transformations, this usually begins in the architectural work with a shift towards self-organizing teams, drawing on the talents of those doing the work. The shift may be small or large in scale, and it may or may not have the support of top management. At this point, we are in what I am calling early stage transitions. Even if the experiment is successful, all of the other principles and processes and practices of 20th century management are still in full force and operating as a drag or an impediment to continuing the implementation. The newly created self-organizing teams will be in tension with everything else that's happening in the firm. Such situations are unstable. The frictions are continuous unless the organization progresses further on the journey and comes to embrace the other agile principles. It is likely to revert to 20th century processes and practices with the frequently heard epitaph, we tried agile and it didn't work. In cases where the group pursuing change is successful and wins support of the top management, the firm may persevere beyond merely creating teams and start embracing the other core agile principles and practices. Where this happens, the firm may enter a kind of middle stage of agile transformation as shown here. Here the firm has been able to introduce all the main agile principles and practices, but it's still carrying on the processes of 20th century strategy, budget, and HR. And this is likely to be causing considerable friction. As these back office functions have long-standing traditions of top-down bureaucratic management, and little or no experience with agile, these functions often become lobbyists for maintaining 20th century versions of their function, but also returning the rest of the organization to 20th century management, and so rescuing the firm from the supposed chaos of agile management. So a lot more work is still needed at this stage to bring the processes of budget and strategy and HR in line with 21st century principles. It's only when these back office functions also embrace an agile mindset that the organization is operating coherently and consistently as an agile organization, as shown here. The firm's principles and processes and practice are now fully in sync with each other. This will only happen if the organization has changed its mindset from seeing the organization as a machine to a complex ecology, Human beings are creating value for other human beings. So a major reason why the shift from 20th century management to 21st century management is taking so long is that this transition isn't easy or quick or simple, but it is essential. And I'm hoping that this way of looking at principles and processes can clarify what's involved. It recognizes that both 20th century management and 21st century management are coherent, internally consistent systems of behavior. It's just that one is a better fit for the 21st century. So if you're working in an organization that can't or won't make the transition, then you might want to consider moving to an organization that is operating in this way. 21st century management is potentially better for those for whom the work is done, the customers, the users, better for those doing the work, and ultimately, when implemented well, more profitable for the firm itself. It's hard not to like people creating value for other people. So I hope you'll join us in making this happen.